Indian society is designed to meet the needs of certain kinds of bodies over others that are deemed disabled. This is made clear in multiple ways, right from how buildings are designed to the types of appearances that are idealized. However, there are important ways in which people with disabilities have contested attempts to sideline their rights. I'm your host Abhishek, and this week on Research Radio, we'll speak to Renu Adlaka about women with visual disabilities and the women's movement. We'll also discuss how medical and legal systems inform our understanding of disability. Dr. Adlaka is with the Center for Women's Development Studies, or CWDS, in New Delhi. She's published several articles in EPW about the topics that we'll be discussing today, and I've shared links to two in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Renu.
Thank you for having me.
So, could we start by discussing what made you interested in researching about disability, and particularly about the experience of women with disabilities?
It was not something that emerged spontaneously. It was actually in itself a journey because I have visual impairment and have been negotiating it in various ways in my life. Things were very different when I was born and in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. So it was still kind of a marginal issue in general, unless you were affected by it. And when you were affected by it, you dealt with it as a private matter. It was not a public issue, and one was very hesitant to engage with it. Although now one sees many disabled people working on disability, at that time when I was growing up, it was not so normal and natural. So there was a certain avoidance built into one's experience of it and one's engagement with it. And hence, I didn't engage with it for a long time. My PhD was actually on looking at mental illness among women. It was a PhD in sociology, but I wanted to look at the social construction of mental illness. And I only actually began engaging with it in the between 2004. And that was actually the point when I began, when I was unemployed, and there was a fellowship. It's the MacArthur Fellowship on sexuality, gender, and reproductive health. And I wanted to really get it. And I picked up the topic of disability and sexuality and reproductive health. And I got the fellowship. And that was actually what began as my journey. By the time that I was already 40 and mature enough to actually handle the issue both epistemically and experientially. So you can see that a lot of my engagement with disability can be looked in a historical way in terms of the emergence of the disability category in academia and public domain, as well as my own lifespan and my own engagement with my identity as a female with disability.
Mm-hmm. And I'd actually like to know more about the historical trajectory of disability that you focused on. In one of the EPW articles, you've written that, quote, instead of giving rights to persons with disabilities and empowering them, a culture of charity and welfare has been systematically promoted in India since the colonial period, end quote. Could you tell us more about this culture and maybe how it has shifted in more recent years?
You know that philanthropy, charity, these are all conceptual categories that emerge in religion. During the colonial period, we had the whole missionary medicine and the whole idea of the civilizing mission of the so-called uncivilized by the colonizers. And within that discourse, there was a way in which impairment, which emerged as a kind of both a medical category, that there was a certain human range of the human capacities of sense organs in terms of sight or hearing or in terms of mental cognition, and there was a certain standardization of these faculties, and those who departed from them were impaired if they were in a deficient kind of way, or they were exceptional, they were geniuses if they exceeded it. So that if your hearing was higher than the normal human range, it was exceptional. It was not a disability. But if it was less, you were disabled, you were impaired. So there's a whole history of disability, poor laws, charity, the church, which emerged in the Western context from the medieval ages. And some of those ideas and institutions, like schools for the deaf, schools for the blind, the asylums, they were transplanted into the colonized territories. And after independence, a lot of those ideas were carried forward. And you know that even schools for the deaf and the blind are still there. They have not been wound up as such. And none of the mental asylums have that were established during the British period have been closed in India, although they've taken on more clinical facets and become more like hospitals, standard hospitals. So that was the kind of discourse and stereotypes around what disability is and who are these disabled people. And many times they do, but people with disabilities do require assistance. They do require some enablers, and hence there's this whole domain of specialness. It's like special education. I mean, they're more requiring maybe other kinds of requirements which the majority do not require, but they consider it special. I mean, that's kind of also a patronizing way of saying, that they're different. So, but specialness kind of sugarcoats the bitterness of disability. So these are the ideas that have been with us for aeons. They continue to be with us if you talk to people in general population, and unfortunately even medical practitioners who have to deal with people with disabilities. These stereotypes and negative understandings continue to persist.
Yes, yes. That helps to understand the origins of this notion of charity and benevolence. So, switching gears a bit, you've underscored the need for the disability rights movement to prioritize sexual rights and women's rights, alongside rights to access education, healthcare, housing, and more.
And employment. When in a family there's a woman with a disability, as I've already tried to kind of explain, her marital chances diminish. Now, as a compensation, many women with disabilities, and this has all gone from my generation, so it's not something very new, and their families realize the need for economic self reliance for women with disabilities, particularly if they are middle class families. And then, in many cases, there is an added emphasis on education and employment by the family and by the woman herself, because that is our survival mechanism, given that marriage is not a certainty. So that's where the situation of women with disabilities becomes a bit different from women without disabilities. Is that in many cases is the new overriding emphasis on education and the need for employment. But the reality is that the dropout from educational institutions and the employment rate is very low for women with disabilities. But surprisingly, if you take women with disabilities and women without disabilities, you will find that in some cases the employment rate for women with disabilities is marginally higher than for women without disabilities, precisely for the reason that I've cited.
Yes. So employment becomes doubly important as well. And along with that, in the article, you've also, mentioned that, quote, disabled persons are expected to reject their bodies as asexual, end quote. Why is it that sexual rights and women's rights are less prioritized? And maybe how has this landscape shifted given the interventions by scholars like yourself and others?
These were moments, as in most domains of life, that were initiated by and dominated by and driven by men with disabilities. So, when it was men with disabilities and the overriding importance of economic factors in the lives of men, the emphasis both in the West and in India, and even now, I would say in the disability rights movement in India, there is an over presence and dominance of men, and the agenda is very much driven by those concerns, and taking in sexuality and reproductive health and these kind of things, they are in the hierarchy of needs, in the hierarchy of advocacy concerns. In from the male viewpoint, they are considered secondary. So that's one very important factor. And you know that men's rights movements that have now spawned are actually, I mean, some call it a backlash to the feminist movement. Whatever it is, the concern with men's sexuality is and one has to also look at the fact of the role of the gay rights movement, and that impact that has had in opening up the issue of sexuality. But one can say that sexuality has been a secondary concern for men in general. But within the feminist movement, because of the overriding issues of reproduction and women's bodies as bodies of procreation and women's roles in the family, the importance of the institution of motherhood and child rearing, these are concerns that have been central in women's lives, and that is why the feminist movement is also very actively and from its inception engaged with sexuality. So, in that sense, if we take the disability rights movement, taking that template into account, one strand which has been dominated by men preoccupied itself and continues to do so with education and employment, and the other strand which is more in conflation with the women's rights movement, though we do have something called feminist disability studies and feminist disability rights movement, but they are sub segments largely within the women and gender rights movement. And they have people like Nidhi Goyal, younger person, but very much in the sexuality kind of frame. And they are engaging. And actually, the ideal scenario would be that two come together. And I do see that happening in the not so distant future, simply because the donors for both these different strands are very often similar donors.
Right, right. And I'm curious about this. How effective can laws and policies, such as the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2006, how effective can they be in furthering the disability rights movement?
As you we know from the women's rights movement in India, law has been fundamental. I mean, whether it's dowry, sati, child marriage, age of marriage. Okay, now one may have a disagreement that what's the point of making laws, half of which cannot and are not implemented, and you don't create the appropriate apparatus for awareness so that the affected persons and every affected person is aware and able to access the law. That's another debate. But law has been a central tool for empowerment in our society. A lot of our legislation, different laws, particularly family laws, laws related to property and inheritance, are discriminatory against persons with disability, particularly people with mental illness. I mean, for example, laws that debarred people who were mentally challenged from voting or from inheritance or marriage being annulled. These laws are still on the statute books, although the 1995 law and the more recent 216 law prohibit this, but they're still part of other laws. And actually, there's a crying need for a total overhaul of all those legal clauses which come in conflict with more recent disability legislation. And I'm very surprised that this process has not even been initiated. I mean, to me, it defies logic. Why, at one level, you're enacting one set of laws empowering anti discrimination, and yet the other provisions still remain? Why should that be the case? And now, another thing that I'd like to just bring, that the confused state of affairs, that although some of the legal provisions that are anti-discriminatory for and really go against provisions that are there in the new law legislation, disability legislation, there are some positive changes. For example, in the 2013 Criminal Law Amendment Act, it's a kind of women-friendly law, but there are provisions for addressing violence against women with disabilities, whether it's that you have to have a sign, you have to have a appropriate interpretation, or the FIR can be filed at any place where the woman chooses, and accessibility has to be ensured to the victim. So these are, and that if the woman is a disabled who has been violated, the quantum of punishment is increased. So these are disability specific provisions in non-disability legislation, but they coexist with the earlier provisions which are so anti-discriminatory.
So clearly, all existing laws need to be probed and amended to ensure that the rights of people with disabilities are safeguarded. And dwelling deeper into the framing of policies, you observe that these laws usually frame disability as a personal tragedy or as an individual problem, which should be evaluated and compensated in select situations. Why is this a convenient but inaccurate description of the problem?
Very often, a person with disability is on their own. For example, when I was growing up, in my school, very often I was the only disabled person. And definitely in my class, I was the only disabled person. In my workplace, I am the only disabled person right now. So there is a certain isolation that develops when it's disability. NGOs are a location where people with disabilities gather together, like schools for the deaf, school for the blind. There you have groupings. But by and large, disability is an individual experience. It is often an individual life, and an effort has to be made to bring in the group dynamics. That is, unless there's a family in which there's a genetic thing going and there's several people with disabilities. That also happens at times. But by and large, it's an individual thing. And medicine looks at disability as a problem of the individual body or mind, and the disabled person more as a patient. And being a patient, hence, is also a kind of tragedy because you're on your own and you have this particular condition. So there's this individualization of disability, and historically, that's how disabled people have been. That it's your fault, maybe, or it's your fate, whatever way you want to look at it. It's your karma. That's one way. But actually, if we look at people, now this is where the disability rights movement from the 1970s came. They said, we reject this medical model of disability. We do not want to look at disability as a personal tragedy, as an individual issue, as a medical problem. We don't want to look at the disabled person as a patient because that's not the only truth. The truth is that it is society which isolates, identifies, labels, differentiates, and normalizes and abnormalizes. There is disableism in society and there is ableism in society. Society is in favor of the able bodied, that is the majority, and society is negatively disposed toward the disabled, which is disableism. And actually, we have to recognize disability as just something which is social. It's because you don't have a ramp that I can't come to your office because you only have stairs, right? If it's because you don't have sign language interpretation that I'm deaf. It's because you don't provide me screen reading software that, and everything is available only in small print and no braille, that I am blind. So you address the special or the specific concerns that I am facing, and that can be addressed socially through social organization, through building, through technology, make society accessible. It's because society is not accessible that I am experiencing disability in my life. And it's also your attitudes and your stereotypes which are inhibiting me. And it's also because communication modalities, if I have sensory disabilities, are not easily accessible, that I can't communicate with you. So you overcome these communicational, attitudinal, and architectural barriers, and the disabled cease to be disabled. They're just different. So, in that sense, disability becomes, like other categories, a collective identity, and there's a transformation from looking at it as an individual problem to conceptualizing it as a social problem and a social issue with socially backed solutions, and hence that is where the whole issue of activism and advocacy comes, that if people with disabilities band together, put pressure, like become a pressure group like other groups, they can push their policies through. But it's more difficult to get disabled people together to be activists and all than women and other marginalized groups.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And you've already mentioned that in quote majority of cases, medicalization helps in maintaining the status quo by working against the claims of the petitioner, end quote. Can you expand on this, particularly on the role that medicalization plays in understanding discerning disability?
Right. So that's your medical legal domain, and the medical legal domain are both macro, structures, power structures in society, both the medicine and law, and very often they collaborate. People who occupy the positions are often very traditional in their thinking. So there's a whole social analysis we can do of these two institutions, in terms of their dynamics, in terms of their operation, in terms of their power, and in terms of how they function. And very often they function in tandem. And we see this a lot in disability legislation that involve people with disabilities. Because if you go back, what is disability in society is actually something that has its origin in the medical discourse. Like, you are considered disabled if your vision is, or if your hearing is below a certain level. Now, if you're above that level, you're not considered disabled. So, someone with 40% visual impairment, is called benchmark disability. That is the lower limit of disability. So that, if you are a doctor's class, if only a doctor can make this judgment and give you a medical certificate or a disability certificate. So if you're 30% visually disabled, you have a visual problem. You can be corrected through glasses, but you're not visually disabled. You can't get the benefits of the disability, nor can you self identify as disabled. And that goes across all disabilities. So, the very definitional nature of disability, which comes up for discussion in the courtroom, is actually predetermined by a doctor, right? So you can see that the judge is not determining whether X is disabled or not. He is relying on the disability certificate issued by the doctor. Although, of course, it happens that in one case, a doctor may certify someone as 50% disabled, and another doctor may certify the same person as 70% disabled. Although there are criteria, these criteria are subject to human interpretation, and hence there may be a disagreement there. And there is nothing to prevent a judge from questioning the doctor's judgment on the basis of his own assessment culled from other sources. But these are rare. By and large, the doctor's judgment is taken as evidence in the courtroom. You really need a very innovative judge to talk about medical judicial interpretation of disability, which does not or which contests the existing definition offered by the medical practitioner.
Right, right. And what do you think the role that your research can play in addressing inequity within and outside institutions?
Well, I think my very presence in institutions itself has an impact. In institutions, I think, especially after 2006, and since I've been in CWDS, I think it's really molded the agenda of the institution, because I'm not going to be a wallflower and sink into the background. And I think it's become a real core issue at CWDS now, and it will remain a core issue even when I leave, because I have done enough foundational work to ensure that it does remain so. And then, I've also written, when I've published, I've made a conscious effort not to publish in disability journals and books. I mean, I've tried to move beyond that, and, no point speaking to the converted. So, Disability in Society is a very reputed journal. It's a very good journal, but I've never really published in a lot of choice, because I want to publish where people who are non-disabled, who have no understanding, no concern, very probably are driven by stereotypes and negativity. I want them to listen. No point talking to the disabled; they already know.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And the next and final question I have is a little more future looking, and it's about some of the unanswered questions that you would like to explore with your future work.
So, one of the unanswered, or one of the questions or issues that continues to that will continue to engage me is, the relationship between disability and medicine, the medical profession. Because medicine is actually very important for people with disabilities. I have my visual impairment. One of the reasons for my visual impairment is glaucoma, which is elevated eye pressure, which if uncontrolled can lead into irreparable visual loss. And I use around 7-8 medicines to control it. I'm very happy that it's able to be controlled through these medicines. So I'm constantly engaged with the medical profession, and it's not always a negative experience. So I want to actually engage with medicine as both a tool of as an enabler for people with disabilities to lead comfortable lives, and as a factor in their disempowerment. That's one very important issue that I really would like to deal with. Then the other thing that I'm interested in is the category of disability. That it's a heterogeneous category. It's not like women, or it's not like Dalit, one supreme identity that you can identify. Then it has variegated kind of manifestations, in terms of other variables. But disability is so different. I mean, someone who is schizophrenic is so different from someone who's suffering from polio, and yet both are disabled. And to me, the issue is it valid or legitimate how valid and legitimate is the category of disability itself? It's this umbrella, but how stable is that umbrella? And given especially in the context that many, for example, autoimmune conditions are disabling in parts of the world. In parts of the world, HIV/AIDS is considered a disability. In parts of the world, cardiovascular disease and diabetes are considered as disabilities. Some people would even like to consider pregnancy as a temporary disability. So, given this kind of spread of potential, I'm wondering how useful the category is. That's another issue that continues to engage me. And then, this whole thing within civil society, why is it the transgenders would want, or the sexuality rights movement would want to deploy that category to say people who are, for example, different in their sexual approach can be disabled in society, should be considered as disabled? Or why do, in the earlier discourses, being a woman, we've often heard this thing, being a woman is a disability. So, how do these other marginalized groups, or Dalits, being Dalit is a disability that is often heard. I mean, is that just a flippant use, or how are they configuring disability? And to me, that comes to this again back to the second question: is how stable is the category of disability? And I think thirdly, another issue that is given in the face of the new genetic research that's coming up with the huge research on stem cells and on chromosomal the research at the chromosomal and at the that level, and the possibility of tweaking are we going to see an end to disabling conditions? Is every human being in 50 years, are they everybody going to look beautiful? And, that social standard is going to be applied to everybody. And what do we do with variation? And how to valorize variation? The fact that I have a visual disability, can I imagine myself as Renu, who was without a visual disability? I can't, because it's so entrenched as a part of my personality. But then if I think in terms, if my parents, when I was going to be born, and they knew that I would have this visual disability, if it's identified, would they have wanted me, or would they have chosen, feticide as a preferred mode? And I don't know, and it is disturbing. So, there's a huge ethical question when one engages with disability, particularly when one engages with disability and medicine. And I think these issues interest me, and I would probably want to carry on doing research with them if the opportunity arises.
Renu, thank you so much for joining us on Research Radio. I think we've gone beyond the work you've published in EPW, and there was a lot to learn.
It's been absolutely my pleasure, and talking also clarifies, and it's like listening to yourself, and you get to learn more about yourself.
Something that stuck with me from what Renu had to say was about how policies treat disability as a personal tragedy or as a problem that resides within an individual, rather than the architecture and social mindsets around us. Renu also goes into granular depth into legal cases, and I recommend reading her article titled Disability Law in India, Paradigm Shift or Evolving Discourse, published in EPW. I've shared a link to it in the description of this podcast. Next week, we'll speak to Balmurli Natarajan and Suraj Jacob about vegetarianism and meat eating in India. The two of them have detailed how, quote, characterizing India as a vegetarian land is a gross misrepresentation of reality, end quote. So there's clearly a lot for us to unpack just in that quote right there. And if this sounds interesting to you, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you don't miss out on it. Thanks for tuning in, take care, and I'll see you next week.